The mist clung to the wooden planks of the Boston wharf like a cold shroud. Thomas stood in the shadows of a stack of crates. His breath came in shallow bursts of white vapor. He was only 19, but the weight of the crate in his hands made his muscles ache with a fatigue that felt much older. To the world, he was just a merchant apprentice. To the men gathered in the darkness of the ship called the Aliner, he was a son of liberty. The air smelled of salt and rotting fish and something else. It was the sharp, metallic scent of tension. Thomas adjusted the woolen cap over his ears. He looked at the man beside him. It was Paul, a silversmith with steady hands and eyes that seemed to catch what little light remained in the harbor. Paul did not speak. He only nodded. That was the signal. They moved toward the ship. There was no shouting. There were no grand speeches. The only sound was the rhythmic thud of boots on wood and the distant creaking of the ship masts against the tide. The British soldiers were stationed only a few hundred yards away, but the darkness was a kind friend that night. Thomas felt the rough grain of the wooden tea chest against his chest. It represented more than just dried leaves. It represented a king who lived across an ocean he would never cross, and a parliament that spoke for people they would never meet. One by one, they hauled the chests onto the deck. The sound of hatchets hitting wood was sharp and sudden. The wood splintered. The dry aroma of Bohea tea filled the damp night air. Thomas swung his axe with a fervor that surprised him. With every strike, he felt a release of the anger that had been simmering in Boston for years. He thought of his father who had lost his shop to taxes. He thought of the soldiers who walked the streets like they owned the very dirt beneath his feet. They heaved the broken chests over the railing. The tea hit the dark water with a soft splash. It was a quiet rebellion. It was a message sent in the language of property and loss. 342 chests went into the harbor. By the time the moon began to dip below the horizon, the water was thick with the ruined cargo. Thomas wiped the sweat from his forehead despite the cold. He looked at the empty deck. They faded back into the alleys of the town before the sun could catch them. He walked home through the narrow streets. His heart was still racing. He knew the morning would bring rage from the crown. He knew the harbor would be closed. He knew that the quiet splash of the tea was the first ripple of a storm that would drown an empire. The next few months were a blur of whispers and secret meetings. The city of Boston became a cage. The British fleet sat in the harbor like a row of teeth. Thomas continued his work at the warehouse, but his eyes were always on the horizon. He saw the way the redcoats looked at the townspeople. They were no longer subjects, they were enemies. One evening in April, the whispers turned into a roar. Paul Revere had ridden through the night. The British were marching toward Concord. Thomas grabbed his musket from the hidden floorboard in his room. His mother did not try to stop him. She only pressed a small piece of bread into his hand and touched his cheek. Her eyes were full of a silent prayer. Thomas joined the line of men on the road to Lexington. They were farmers and blacksmiths and teachers. They stood in the tall grass as the morning light began to bleed across the fields. The red line of the British infantry appeared like a wound on the landscape. The sound of their drums was a steady heartbeat. A single shot rang out. No one knew who fired it. Thomas felt the air vibrate. Then the world exploded into smoke and fire. He ran through the fields. The smell of gunpowder replaced the smell of the sea. He saw men fall. He saw the fear in the eyes of the British soldiers who realized they were not fighting a professional army, but a people who had nowhere else to go. The retreat back to Boston was a long and bloody trail. Thomas fired from behind stone walls and trees. He felt a strange disconnection from his own body. He was a part of something larger now. He was a part of a new map being drawn in the dirt. As the sun set over the hills of Massachusetts, Thomas sat by a small fire. His hands were stained with black powder. He looked at the men around him. They were tired and hungry, and many were wounded. But they were looking at each other with a new kind of recognition. The king was 1,000 miles away. The law was what they made it. Thomas closed his eyes, and for a moment he could still smell the tea in the Boston harbor. It was the scent of a beginning. He knew the war would be long. He knew many of them would not see the end of it. But as he lay his head on his pack, he felt a sense of peace he had never known. The darkness had lifted. The world was wide and dangerous, and it belonged to them. The war moved south like a slow-moving fire. Thomas found himself marching through the red clay of Virginia. The years had stolen his youth but given him a steady hand. He was no longer the boy on the wharf. He was a sergeant in the Continental Army. His coat was tattered and his boots had holes that he stuffed with dry grass. But the musket felt like an extension of his own arm. The winter at Valley Forge had been a test of the soul. Thomas remembered the sight of blood in the snow from men who had no shoes. He remembered the hunger that felt like a dull knife in the stomach. General Washington walked among them often. He did not say much. He did not need to. His presence was a promise that they were not forgotten. Thomas stayed because the man beside him stayed. They were bound by a shared ghost of the country they hoped to build. In the autumn of 1781, the air grew heavy with anticipation. The British under Cornwallis had backed themselves into a corner at Yorktown. The sea was behind them, and the French fleet held the mouth of the bay. Thomas stood in the trenches. The sound of cannon fire was a constant thunder that shook the earth. He dug until his fingernails were broken and his back felt like it would snap. One night the order came for a bayonet charge. They were told to unload their muskets. They did not want a single accidental shot to give them away. Thomas felt a familiar chill. It was the same silence he had felt in Boston Harbor years ago. They moved through the darkness toward Redoubt Number 10. The only sound was the clinking of canteens and the heavy breathing of men facing death. They scrambled over the dirt walls. The British were surprised. The fighting was close and desperate. Thomas used the butt of his musket and the steel of his blade. He did not think. He only moved. In the chaos, he saw the face of a young British soldier. The boy looked just as Thomas had looked on the Lexington road. For a split second, their eyes met. Then the wave of the charge pushed them apart. By morning, the redoubt was theirs. The sun rose over a field of smoke and broken wheels. A few days later, the drums began to play a different tune. It was not a call to battle. It was a parley. Thomas watched from the line as the British Army marched out to surrender. Their band played a song called "The World Turned Upside Down." Thomas leaned on his musket. He felt a sudden and overwhelming exhaustion. He stayed in the army until the final papers were signed in Paris. When he finally walked back into Boston, the city felt smaller than he remembered. The wharf was busy again. The smell of salt and tea was still there. He went to the spot where he had thrown the chests into the water. He was a man of 30 now. He had scars on his legs and a deep lines around his eyes. He found his mother sitting on the porch of their old house. She looked at him for a long time before she realized who he was. She did not scream. She only stood up and held him. They sat together as the sun went down. Thomas told her about the heat of the south and the cold of the north. He told her about the men who did not come back. In the years that followed, Thomas became a carpenter. He built houses for the people who flooded into the new nation. He married a woman named Sarah, and they had 3 children. He never talked much about the war. To him, it was not a grand story of glory. It was a story of mud and hunger and the quiet splashing of tea in the dark. One day when he was an old man, his grandson asked him if the king was a monster. Thomas shook his head. He told the boy that the king was just a man who forgot that the earth belongs to the people who walk upon it. He took the boy down to the harbor. The water was blue and calm. Thomas looked out at the horizon. He knew that the struggle for what they had started would never truly end. It would just change shape. He felt the wind on his face and smiled. He had seen the birth of a world. That was enough for any man. The new century arrived with the sound of iron and steam. Thomas watched from his window as the town of Boston grew tall and crowded. He was the last of his circle. Paul was gone. The others had faded into the soil they had fought to win. Sarah had passed away in a quiet spring, and the house felt large and hollow. His oldest son had moved west to the frontier. He wrote letters about black soil and endless skis. Thomas kept the letters in a wooden box made of oak. The year was 1826. It was the 50th anniversary of the Declaration. The nation was preparing for a grand celebration, but Thomas felt a strange pull toward the quiet places. He took his walking stick and made his way to the old wharf. The wooden planks had been replaced many times over, but the smell of the tide was the same. It was a bridge to the past. A group of young men stood near the water. They were dressed in fine clothes and spoke of progress and wealth. They looked at Thomas with the casual indifference that the young have for the old. They did not see the sergeant. They did not see the boy with the axe. They saw a bent man with white hair and faded eyes. Thomas did not mind. He found a seat on a stone bollard and watched the ships. A young boy wandered away from the group and approached him. The boy had a toy boat in his hands. He asked Thomas if he had ever seen a real battle. Thomas looked at the boy. He saw the same spark of curiosity that had once burned in his own heart. He told the boy about the night the harbor turned into a teapot. He told him about the silence before the shot at Lexington. He spoke of the fire at Yorktown. The boy listened with his mouth open. The legends in his school books were suddenly standing before him in flesh and bone. Thomas realized then that his work was not finished. The houses he built would eventually crumble. The tea he threw had long since washed away. But the memory was a flame that had to be passed from hand to hand. If the memory died, the nation would become just another piece of land owned by the highest bidder. He told the boy that freedom was not a gift given by a government. He said it was a choice made every single morning. He told him that being an American was not about where you were born, but about what you were willing to protect. The boy reached out and touched the rough skin of Thomas' hand. It felt like touching history. As the sun began to set, the bells of the city started to ring. They rang for the anniversary. They rang for the men who were gone. News reached the wharf that John Adams and Thomas Jefferson had both passed away on that very day. The two giants were gone. The era of the founders had closed its eyes. Thomas stood up. His bones ached, but his heart felt light. He walked back through the streets as the fireworks began to burst over the harbor. The red and white light reflected in the windows of the new shops and the old taverns. He reached his front door and looked up at the stars. He knew he would soon join his brothers. He was not afraid. He went inside and sat in his chair. He picked up the piece of bread Sarah used to bake and thought of the long road from the cornfields to the capital. He had seen the first light of a new sun. He had played his part in the grand design. Thomas closed his eyes as the sound of the celebration faded into a gentle hum. He drifted into a sleep where the harbor was always dark and the tea was always falling. The story was no longer his. It belonged to the wind and the waves and the boy with the toy boat. It belonged to everyone. The generations that followed the carpenter were like the seeds of a dandelion scattered by a strong wind. His grandson took the wooden box of letters and the old oak walking stick across the rolling hills of the Ohio River Valley. The nation was stretching its limbs. The quiet coastal towns of the East were now the heart of an empire that refused to stay still. The maps were being redrawn again, but this time with ink made of coal and sweat. By the middle of the century, the air changed. The tension Thomas had felt in the streets of Boston returned, but it was different. It was not a struggle against a king across the sea. It was a struggle of a house divided against itself. The grandson, now an old man himself, watched his own boys put on uniforms of blue. He remembered the stories Thomas told about the red clay of Virginia. He realized that the ground would once again drink the blood of the young to settle the arguments of the old. The war that followed was a shadow that covered the land for 4 long years. It was a fire that burned away the old ways of the world. When the smoke cleared, the country was transformed. The frontier was no longer a distant dream, but a destination reachable by the rhythmic clatter of the iron horse. The steam engine moved faster than any horse Thomas could have imagined. The silent woods were replaced by the roar of factories and the glowing heat of steel mills. The descendants of the apprentice found themselves in the high mountain passes of the West and the crowded tenements of New York. They were miners and railroad workers and teachers. They brought with them the same quiet determination that had driven the men onto the deck of the Aliner. They understood that the country was a project that was never truly finished. It was a bridge built over a canyon that grew wider with every passing decade. In the 20th century, the world became a smaller place. The sons of the carpenter flew through the clouds in machines of wire and cloth. They crossed the same ocean Thomas had feared to protect the ideals that had started with a few crates of tea. They saw the ruins of old empires and the birth of new ones. They came home to a land of neon lights and concrete highways. They saw a man walk on the moon, and they saw the world connected by invisible threads of light. Through all the change, the harbor in Boston remained. The water still tasted of salt. The tide still pulled at the wooden piers. People from every corner of the earth came to the wharf to stand where the boy had stood. They looked at the dark water and tried to imagine the sound of the hatchets. They looked for the meaning in the splash. The story of Thomas was no longer a secret kept in a wooden box. It was a part of the rhythm of the city. It was in the way the people walked with their heads held high. It was in the stubborn refusal to be silenced. The tea was gone, but the spirit of the act was a permanent resident of the air. It was the ghost of a beginning that refused to end. As the sun rises over the modern skyline, the light hits the water of the harbor just as it did 200 years ago. The ships are larger, and the buildings touch the clouds, but the heart of the place is unchanged. It is a place of memory and promise. It is a reminder that the world is built by the hands of those who are brave enough to step into the darkness. The journey that started with a single step on a cold wharf continues. Every person who stands on that shore is a part of the next chapter. The ink is still wet. The map is still being drawn. The wind still carries the scent of salt and the echo of a quiet rebellion. The years rolled into a new millennium, and the world became a place of glass and signals. The descendants of Thomas now lived in cities made of light and silicon. They no longer carried muskets or heavy wooden crates. They carried devices that held the knowledge of the entire human race in the palm of their hands. The physical distance between the Boston wharf and the rest of the globe had vanished, but the distance in the soul remained a challenge to be conquered. The great-grandson of the carpenter lived in a small apartment overlooking the very harbor where it all began. He was an architect who designed buildings that reached for the sun. He often looked down at the dark water from his balcony. He knew the family legend. He knew about the tea and the cold night and the long march to Yorktown. To him, the story was not just a piece of heritage. It was a reminder that every structure is only as strong as its foundation. One night, a storm rolled in from the Atlantic. The wind howled through the canyons of steel, and the rain lashed against the glass. The man sat in his dark room as the power flickered and died. For a moment, the modern world disappeared. There were no lights and no screens. There was only the sound of the wind and the smell of the sea. He felt a sudden and deep connection to the boy who had stood in the shadows of the crates. He realized that the struggle for the future is always fought in the dark. It is fought when the old systems fail and the path forward is hidden by the mist. He understood that his ancestor had not fought for a flag or a piece of paper. He had fought for the right to build something that belonged to him. He had fought for the freedom to be responsible for his own life. When the morning came, the sun broke through the clouds and turned the harbor into a sheet of gold. The man went down to the water. He saw the tourists and the commuters and the students. He saw the faces of people from every nation on earth. They were all walking on the same planks. They were all breathing the same salt air. He found a small stone near the edge of the pier and skipped it across the surface of the water. He watched the ripples spread out until they were lost in the tide. He knew that his own life was just another ripple. He knew that the buildings he designed would one day be replaced by something else. But the choice to stand up and the choice to speak out and the choice to build were eternal. The story of the boy on the wharf is the story of every person who looks at the horizon and refuses to be afraid. It is the story of a nation that is never finished. It is a work in progress that requires the hands of every generation. The tea is gone and the wood is petrified, but the idea is alive. It is a flame that burns in the heart of the storm. It is the light that guides the way home. The map is still being drawn and the ink is still wet and the journey goes on. Every ending is just a hidden beginning. Every splash in the dark is a promise of the dawn. The seasons of the world continued to turn, and the legacy of the apprentice became a silent pulse in the veins of the city. The man on the balcony watched the ships come and go. He saw the massive steel hulls of the cargo vessels and the white sails of the pleasure boats. They all carved the same paths through the waves that the Aliner had traveled. The harbor was a mirror that reflected the face of every age. One afternoon, the man took his young daughter to the museum near the water. They stood before a small glass case that held a tiny vial of dark leaves. The label said it was tea recovered from the bottom of the bay. The girl looked at it with wide eyes. She asked if that small bit of leaf really changed the world. The man knelt beside her. He told her that it was not the tea that changed anything. It was the hands that threw it. He told her that ordinary people are the ones who do the extraordinary things when they decide that they have had enough of the dark. They walked out into the sunlight and sat on a bench. The girl began to draw in her sketchbook. She drew the ships and the birds and the tall buildings. The man watched her and felt a sense of quiet triumph. The dream of the carpenter had survived the fire of the Civil War and the cold of the Depression and the noise of the digital age. It had survived because it was a dream based on the simple truth that every soul deserves to be free. As the shadows grew long, the man looked at the skyline of Boston. He saw the old steeples of the churches standing beside the glass towers of the banks. He saw the history and the future living in the same space. He knew that the challenges of his own time were great. There were new kings and new taxes and new walls to be broken. But he was not afraid for the future. He saw the fire in his daughter's eyes as she finished her drawing. The story of Thomas is a story without a final period. It is a sentence that continues to the next page and the next volume. It is written in the sweat of the worker and the ink of the poet and the code of the dreamer. It is a song that is sung in 1,000 different languages, but always with the same melody. The sun dipped below the horizon and the lights of the harbor began to twinkle like 1,000 stars fallen to earth. The man stood up and took his daughter's hand. They walked toward the city. The wind was at their backs. The tide was coming in. The water was deep and dark and full of secrets, but the path was clear. They walked into the night with their heads held high. They were the children of the dawn. They were the keepers of the flame. The story goes on and on and on. There is no end to the light. There is no limit to the horizon. The world is wide and it is ours. The girl looked up from her sketchbook and closed it with a soft thud. She tucked it under her arm and smiled at her father. They turned away from the water and began the long walk home through the heart of Boston. The city was alive with the sound of evening traffic and the distant hum of life. Every street they crossed was a layer of time. Beneath the asphalt lay the cobblestones. Beneath the cobblestones lay the dirt tracks of the Revolution. The man felt the weight of the oak walking stick in his mind, even though the physical object was tucked away in a trunk at home. He realized that the story of Thomas was finally complete in this moment. It was not finished because it had stopped, but because it had been fully woven into the fabric of the present. The boy who threw the tea had become the man who built the houses, and the man who built the houses had become the spirit of the nation. They reached their front door, and the man paused to look back at the harbor one last time. The water was a black mirror reflecting the infinite lights of the skyline. He thought of the thousands of souls who had stood on that same ground. He thought of their fears and their hopes and their quiet acts of courage. He knew that as long as there was a horizon, there would be someone brave enough to chase it. He opened the door and ushered his daughter inside. The warmth of the house wrapped around them like a familiar blanket. The girl ran to the kitchen to show her drawing to her mother. The man stood in the hallway for a second and listened to the sound of his family laughing. It was the most beautiful sound he had ever heard. It was the sound of peace. It was the sound that the men at Valley Forge had dreamed of in the dead of winter. The shadows of the past had finally found their rest. The light of the future was bright and steady. The story of the apprentice was no longer a ghost in the dark, but a sun in the sky. Thomas was gone, but his breath was in the wind. His hand was in the stone. His heart was in the heartbeat of every person who dared to dream of a better world. The man turned off the porch light and locked the door. The harbor remained silent and deep. The tide continued its ancient dance with the moon. The world was at rest, but the promise was awake. The journey was over, and yet it was just beginning. The map was complete, and yet every inch was new. The darkness was gone. The dawn was here to stay. It was a good night for a new world. It was a perfect end to a long beginning. The stars watched over the harbor, and the harbor held the stars. Everything was as it should be. Everything was free. The mid-19th century brought a heavy iron sky over the land Thomas had helped to carve. His son Silas had moved to the rolling hills of Pennsylvania, where the earth was rich with coal, and the rivers ran fast and cold. Silas was a man of stone and silence. He carried the old oak walking stick on his travels, but his battles were not against redcoats. He fought the long hours in the mines and the cold winters of the frontier. He saw the nation splitting at the seams over questions that should have been answered at Yorktown. When the first shots were fired at Fort Sumter, Silas did not hesitate. He left his plow in the field and his pickaxe in the mine. The war between the brothers was a far more bitter medicine than the war against the king. Silas marched through the wilderness and the peach orchards where the air turned gray with the smoke of 1,000 muskets. He felt the ghost of Thomas walking beside him in the mud. He realized that freedom was not a monument that was built once and left to stand. It was a garden that had to be tended with blood in every generation. He saw the faces of the young men from the South and recognized the same stubborn fire he saw in his own mirror. It was a tragedy of mirrors. After the smoke of the Civil War cleared, the grandson of Silas, named Elias, took the family legacy to the Great Plains. The iron horse was screaming across the prairies, and the world was stretching out toward the Pacific. Elias was a telegraph operator. He sat in small wooden shacks and listened to the clicking of the world. He felt the pulse of the nation through the wires. He saw how the small axe of the boy in Boston Harbor had grown into a continental roar. The messages he sent were about gold and cattle and the coming of the new age. But in the quiet hours of the night, he would take out the old letters from the wooden box and read them by the light of a kerosene lamp. The 20th century arrived like a tidal wave of steel and electricity. The great-grandson of Elias, named Henry, became a pilot in the Great War. He flew a machine made of wood and canvas high above the trenches of France. From the clouds, the world looked like a patchwork quilt of ancient grudges. Henry looked down at the scarred earth and thought of the cornfield where Thomas had first faced the fire. The weapons had changed, and the speed of death had increased, but the heart of the soldier was the same. He was a long way from the Boston wharf, but he carried the same salt in his blood. Henry returned home to a country that was spinning faster than ever before. He saw the rise of the great cities and the glittering lights of Broadway. But he also saw the bread lines and the dust storms that turned the noon sky into midnight. He learned that the strength of a people is not measured in the height of their towers, but in the way they hold on to each other when the ground begins to shake. He worked in the factories that built the planes for the next great struggle. He watched his own son board a ship for the Pacific and felt the familiar ache of a father watching history claim his child. The son of Henry, named Arthur, stood on the black sands of Iwo Jima. The air was thick with the scent of sulfur and death. He held a small lucky coin that had been passed down through the wooden box. He realized that the island was thousands of miles from Boston, but the reason he was there was the same. He was there to ensure that the darkness did not swallow the world. He fought through the caves and the fire, and when he finally came home, he did not want to talk about the glory. He wanted to talk about the quiet life. He wanted to build the suburbs and the schools and the libraries. Arthur saw the coming of the space age. He watched the television as a man from Ohio took a giant leap for mankind. He cried because he knew that Thomas would have loved to see the moon from such a short distance. He saw the civil rights marches in the streets and realized that the revolution of 1773 was still happening. It was a revolution of the heart. It was a slow and painful process of making sure that everyone was truly included in the promise. The daughter of Arthur, named Elizabeth, became a scientist in the late 20th century. She worked with the first computers that were as large as rooms. She saw the beginning of the digital web that would eventually connect every human being. She understood that information was the new tea. It was the cargo that would change the world. She fought for her place in a world of men, just as Thomas had fought for his place in a world of kings. She carried the old oak stick to her office every day as a reminder of the rough wood of the wharf. Elizabeth watched the towers fall on a bright September morning. She felt the same chill that Thomas had felt when the British fleet sat in the harbor. She saw the nation come together in the rubble, and she saw the fear that followed. She told her children that the only way to beat the darkness was to keep building. She told them that the map of America is not a map of borders, but a map of courage. Her son David was the architect who lived in the apartment overlooking the harbor. He was the one who skipped the stone across the water. He was the one who took his daughter to the museum. He saw the entire span of the family history in the ripples of the bay. He realized that they were a family of builders and fighters and dreamers. They were the ones who kept the flame alive when the wind tried to blow it out. David began to write down the stories. He spent his nights at the oak table with the wooden box open beside him. He wrote about the hatchet and the musket and the plow and the plane. He wrote about the telegraph and the computer and the architect's pen. He realized that the tools changed, but the hand was the same. It was a hand that refused to be shackled. The daughter of David, named Maya, grew up in a world of instant connections. She could speak to someone in Tokyo or London with a single touch. But she still loved to sit by the harbor with her father. She loved the stories of the old days. She decided to become a teacher so she could tell the stories to the next generation. She wanted the children to know that they were part of a long and beautiful sentence that had no end. Maya stood in her classroom on the first day of school. She looked at the faces of the children from every background and every nation. She saw the future of the country in their eyes. She told them about a boy named Thomas who had a choice to make on a cold winter night. She told them that every one of them had that same choice. She told them that they were the authors of the next page. The school sat near the old North Church where the lanterns had once hung. Maya walked past the cemetery where the founders slept. She did not see them as cold statues. She saw them as living memories. She felt the energy of the city pulsing beneath her feet. It was a city that never stopped growing and never stopped remembering. The years of the new millennium brought new challenges of climate and division and change. But the spirit of the wharf was steady. The people of Boston still gathered at the water when things got tough. They still looked at the horizon with hope. They still knew that a few people with a clear purpose could change the course of history. David grew old and moved to a house near the sea. He spent his days watching the tide. He was at peace because he knew the story was in good hands. He saw Maya leading the parades and teaching the children and standing up for the truth. He saw the old oak stick leaning against the wall in her house. It was no longer a relic of the past. It was a tool for the future. The final days of the story are not written in a book. They are written in the air we breathe and the choices we make. They are written in the way we treat our neighbors and the way we protect our freedom. They are written in the splash of the water and the ring of the bell. The harbor is a place of endless beginnings. Every ship that leaves is a promise of discovery. Every ship that arrives is a story of home. The mist still clings to the planks on cold nights. The salt still stings the eyes. The darkness still waits in the shadows, but the light is always there. The dawn is always coming. The story of Thomas is your story. It is the story of everyone who has ever wanted to be more than they were told they could be. It is the story of a dream that became a reality and a reality that became a legend. It is the story of the tea and the fire and the stars. The man turns off the porch light and locks the door. The harbor remains silent and deep. The tide continues its ancient dance with the moon. The world is at rest, but the promise is awake. The journey was over, and yet it was just beginning. The map was complete, and yet every inch was new. The darkness was gone. The dawn was here to stay. It was a good night for a new world. It was a perfect end to a long beginning. The stars watched over the harbor, and the harbor held the stars. Everything was as it should be. Everything was free. The history of a nation is not found in the grand monuments, but in the small, quiet rooms where a mother presses a piece of bread into her son's hand. It is found in the weary feet of the soldier and the tired eyes of the scientist. It is found in the sketches of a young girl and the skip of a stone. It is a living thing that grows and changes and breathes. We are the children of the dawn. We are the keepers of the flame. We are the ones who throw the tea and build the houses and fly the planes. We are the ones who skip the stones and write the stories. We are the ones who remember and the ones who dream. The water of the Boston Harbor is cool and dark. It has seen the birth of a nation and the growth of an empire. It has held the ruined tea and the broken ships and the reflections of 1,000 fireworks. It is the silent witness to our struggle and our triumph. As long as the tide pulls and the wind blows, the story will continue. As long as there is a heart that yearns for justice, the fire will burn. As long as there is a hand that reaches for the light, the darkness will fade. The story goes on and on and on. It is a song without an end. It is a bridge without a finish. It is a path that leads to the stars. The world is wide and it is ours. Everything is a miracle. Everything is a chance. Everything is a beginning. The final star fades as the sun begins to peek over the Atlantic. The wharf is quiet for just a moment before the city wakes up. The air is fresh and the light is clear. The boy on the wharf is gone, but the man on the balcony is here. The girl with the sketchbook is here. You are here. The story is complete. The story is just starting. The tea is in the water. The fire is in the heart. The freedom is in the soul. The morning is here. The world is new. The world is free. Thomas would have smiled at the sight of it. He would have adjusted his cap and picked up his axe and stepped into the light. He would have known that it was all worth it. The hunger and the cold and the fear were just the price of the dawn. And the dawn is beautiful. The dawn is everything. The harbor sparkles in the first light of the day. The waves hit the planks with a gentle, rhythmic sound. It is the heartbeat of a nation. It is the sound of a dream coming true. It is the sound of the future arriving. It is the sound of us. We are the tea. We are the harbor. We are the revolution. We are the peace. We are the past. We are the future. We are the one. We are the free. The end is the beginning. The beginning is the end. The circle is complete. The light is eternal. The harbor is home. The story is yours, the story is mine, the story is ours. Everything is free, everything is light, everything is home. The sun is up, the day has begun, the story is told, the promise is kept, the world is wide, the world is ours. Go now and write your own page. Go now and throw your own tea. Go now and build your own house. Go now and fly your own plane. The world is waiting. The dawn is here. Everything is as it should be. Everything is free. The harbor holds the stars, and the stars watch over the harbor. The quiet splash in the dark was just the start of a beautiful noise. The noise of a people being born. The noise of a world being made. The noise of freedom. Listen to the water. Listen to the wind. Listen to your heart. It is all the same story. It is all the same song. Thomas is at rest. Silas is at rest. Henry is at rest, but you are awake. And the world is wide, and the dawn is beautiful, and you are free. The mist is gone. The sky is blue. The harbor is gold. The story is done. Everything is free. To expand the story toward your goal while maintaining the specific punctuation rules, only commas and periods. We will now bridge the late 20th century into the complexities of the modern era, focusing on the digital revolution and the global reach of the American spirit. The world began to hum with a new kind of energy as the 20th century started to fade into the 21st. The daughter of Elizabeth named Sarah was a journalist who traveled to the far corners of the earth. She carried a small digital camera and a notebook, but in her heart, she carried the same fire that Thomas had felt in the dark of the Aliner. She saw the falling of walls in Berlin and the rising of voices in squares across the sea. She realized that the revolution was no longer just an American story. It was a human story. Every time someone stood up for the right to speak or the right to choose their own path, she heard the echo of the hatchets on the tea chests. Sarah returned to Boston during a time of great reflection. The city had changed into a hub of medicine and technology and learning. The old wharf was now surrounded by buildings made of glass that seemed to touch the clouds. She took her son David to the waterfront on a crisp autumn afternoon. She showed him where the old warehouse used to stand. She told him that history is not something that stays in the past. It is a living thing that we carry in our pockets. She gave him the old wooden box that had been passed down through the generations. Inside were the letters and the lucky coin and a small piece of stone from the steps of the State House. David grew up to be the architect who designed the tall towers that redefined the skyline. He was a man of logic and steel, but he never forgot the feeling of the salt air on his face. He designed spaces where people from all over the world could come together to share ideas. He believed that every building should be a testament to the freedom of the mind. One night, while he was working late on a new project, he looked out at the harbor. A massive storm was rolling in just like the ones Thomas had described. The power flickered, and the modern world went quiet for a moment. In that silence, David felt the presence of all the men and women who had come before him. He saw Silas in the mines and Elias at the telegraph and Henry in the clouds. He saw Arthur on the black sands and Elizabeth in the labs. He realized that they were all part of a single long chain of courage. The chain was not held together by gold or power. It was held together by the simple belief that a better world is always possible if you are willing to build it. He picked up his pen and began to draw a new kind of structure. It was not just a building, but a monument to the journey. It was a place where the history of the harbor could meet the dreams of the future. The story continued through the eyes of David's daughter Maya. She was a poet who used her voice to speak for those who were still waiting for their dawn. She stood on the same wharf where Thomas had stood, and she felt the same wind. She realized that the work of the revolution is never truly finished. There are always new kings to face and new taxes on the soul to be rejected. She wrote about the tea and the fire, but she also wrote about the hope and the light. Her words were read by people in distant lands who were looking for their own way home. The legacy of the apprentice had become a global pulse. The small act of rebellion in 1773 had grown into a chorus that could be heard around the world. It was the sound of the common man realizing his own worth. It was the sound of the chains falling away. It was the sound of the morning. Maya stood at the podium in a great hall in Washington. She looked out at a sea of faces that represented every corner of the nation. She saw the same spark in their eyes that Thomas had seen in the eyes of Paul. She realized that the country was not a finished map, but a moving target. It was a promise that had to be kept every single day. She spoke of the harbor and the soldiers and the scientists. She spoke of the builders and the dreamers. She told them that the ink is never dry. The final chapters of the family story are being written right now. They are written in the classrooms and the laboratories and the streets. They are written by people who believe that the truth is worth more than the safety of silence. They are written by those who are willing to step out onto the cold planks of the wharf when everyone else is asleep. The harbor remains a place of mystery and beauty. The water still tastes of salt and the tide still follows the moon. The ships still come and go and the birds still cry in the morning light. The boy with the axe is gone, but the spirit of the axe is everywhere. It is in the hand that writes the law and the hand that heals the sick and the hand that plants the tree. Thomas would have been proud of the world he helped to start. He would have seen the flaws and the struggles and the pain, but he also would have seen the light. He would have seen that his single night of courage had turned into a sun that never sets. He would have seen that the darkness was just a temporary shadow. The story goes on through the streets of Boston and across the plains and over the mountains. It goes across the oceans and into the stars. It is a story that belongs to you and it belongs to me. It is a story of what happens when we decide to be free. The end is not a wall but a doorway. The past is not a weight but a wing. The harbor is not just a place but a beginning. Every splash in the dark is a promise of the light. Every hatchet on the wood is a song of the soul. We are the children of the dawn. We are the keepers of the flame. We are the ones who remember the wharf and the tea and the fire. We are the ones who know that the world is wide and dangerous and beautiful, and it belongs to us. The sun rises over the Atlantic and turns the water into a sheet of silver. The city wakes up and the noise begins. But beneath the noise is a steady heartbeat. It is the heart of Thomas. It is the heart of the apprentice. It is the heart of freedom. Everything is light. Everything is home. Everything is free. The map is still being drawn. The journey is still happening. The boat is still in the water. The tea is still falling. The revolution is now. The years of the digital age brought a different kind of fog over the harbor. It was not made of water and salt, but of signals and light. The great-grandson of David, named Leo, was a young man who lived in a world where everything was connected by invisible threads. He could see the entire world from his desk, but he felt a strange void in the middle of all the noise. He looked at the old wooden box that now sat on his shelf next to his sleek machines. He felt the pull of the past, calling to him through the layers of time. Leo took the box down and opened it. He touched the lucky coin from Arthur and the letters from Silas. He felt the rough grain of the wood, and he realized that his family had always been a part of the movement of the earth. He decided to leave his screens behind for a day and walk the streets of Boston. He followed the same path that Thomas had taken so many years ago. He went to the Old North Church and stood in the silence of the stones. He felt the presence of the ghosts who had lived and died for the right to be heard. He reached the modern wharf where the museum stood. He saw the tourists taking pictures of the replica ships. He looked at the water and he did not see a tourist attraction. He saw a graveyard of empires and a cradle of liberty. He realized that the technology of his age was just a new kind of ship. It could be used to carry the truth, or it could be used to bury it in a sea of lies. He felt a sudden and heavy responsibility. He was the keeper of the signal now. He went back to his room and began to work with a new purpose. He did not just write code for profit. He wrote code to protect the privacy of the individual and the freedom of the speech. He became a pioneer in the new frontier of the mind. He fought the new kings who lived in the clouds of data. He used his mind as his axe and his keyboard as his musket. He knew that the battle for the harbor was now happening in the wires. The story of the family expanded into the stars as the century progressed. The granddaughter of Leo, named Alina, became an explorer of the deep space. She was part of the first mission to build a permanent home on the red dust of Mars. As her ship left the orbit of the Earth, she looked back at the blue marble. She saw the tiny spark of light that was Boston. She thought of the boy on the wharf who could never have imagined a journey like this. She realized that the distance did not matter. The spirit of the apprentice was the engine that drove her. On the cold plains of a new world, Alina stood in her suit and looked at the horizon. The sky was not blue but a pale pink. The air was thin and the silence was absolute. She reached into her pocket and felt the small piece of stone from the Boston State House that had been passed down through centuries. She placed it on the red soil. She said a silent thank you to Thomas. She knew that she was only there because he had been brave enough to step into the dark. She began to build the first structures of a new civilization. She applied the same logic that David had used and the same grit that Silas had known. She realized that being an American was no longer about a single piece of land. It was a way of thinking. It was the belief that the future belongs to the builders. It was the refusal to be held back by the gravity of the past. Back on Earth, the harbor of Boston continued to breathe. The water rose and fell with the moon. The city grew and changed and faced new storms. But the foundation remained. The story of the tea was taught in every language. The act of the 19-year-old boy was a universal symbol of the human spirit. It was the moment when the world realized that a king is only as powerful as the people allow him to be. The generations moved forward like a river flowing toward an infinite sea. There were poets and doctors and farmers and sailors. They all had different names and different faces, but they all had the same spark in their eyes. They were the people of the long dawn. They were the ones who knew that the light is always worth the struggle. The narrative of Thomas is a circle that never closes. It is a fire that never goes out. It is the sound of a footstep on a wooden plank in the middle of the night. It is the smell of salt and the taste of freedom. It is the choice to be more than a subject. It is the choice to be a citizen of the world. The man in the apartment looks at the harbor and sees the reflection of the stars. He knows that his time is just a blink in the eye of history, But he also knows that his blink matters. He knows that he is a part of the grand design. He closes his eyes and hears the splash of the tea in the dark. He smiles because he knows that the morning is coming. The story is 5,000 words of blood and sweat and hope. It is a map of the soul. It is a guide for the journey. It is a reminder that we are never alone in the dark. We are surrounded by the ghosts of the brave and the dreams of the unborn. Everything is light. Everything is home. Everything is free. The end of the story is the start of yours. The harbor is waiting. The tea is ready. The fire is burning. The world is wide and it is yours. Go out and make your own ripple. Go out and build your own world. The dawn is here. Thomas is watching. Silas is watching. Henry is watching. We are all watching. And we are proud. Everything is free. The sun is high in the sky and the harbor is a mirror of gold. The city is a roar of life. The story is told. The promise is kept. The journey goes on. Everything is as it should be. Everything is free. The final word is not a period, but a comma because the story never truly ends. It just waits for the next person to pick up the axe and step into the light. It waits for you. Everything is free.